Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk About Brand. I, of course, am your host, Christine Gritmon, and I really love digging into what branding means, how it connects to marketing, all these different angles each week. And this week, we're going to talk about it from the angle of persuasion. What is persuasion? How does branding fit into persuasion? And what does soulfulness have to do with it? That's coming up because this week's guest is Jason Harris. He is the author of the book, The Soulful Art of Persuasion. And so we talk today about, what persuasion is, what it means, what branding has to do with your ability to persuade. What are some of the elements that your brand really needs to have in place in order to be persuasive? We even talk about how the art of persuasiveness has changed over time and how brands have had to change to accommodate it. So it's a very exciting discussion, lots of geeking out, lots of digging into what we mean by the words we're using when we talk about brand soul, when we talk about brand even, and when we talk about persuasion. All right, so let's get to it. We are going to be talking about branding and persuasion and how you kind of can't really persuade with the same heft, with the same soul, as it were, without a strong brand. So our guest today certainly knows all about that. Jason Harris is the co-founder and CEO of Mekanism, and he is the author of The Soulful Art of Persuasion. Spoiler alert, brand is a big part of that. And he is the host of the Soul and Science podcast. So we're certainly going to be diving into, the psychology, because all marketing and all branding really is ultimately social psychology. We're going to be digging into what persuasion really is and how branding plays a really, really important role in all of that. Without any further ado, let's bring him on. Hello, come on down, Jason.
All right, I like the applause. It really makes me feel good.
We like making our guest stars feel like rock stars here because they are. Hello.
Hello. All right. I love that.
All right, cool. So let's kind of dive into what we're talking about when we talk about persuasion. And before we started recording, we were talking about sort of branding and marketing and kind of the lines between these things. And I posited that branding is making the connection that you can then leverage via marketing to persuade. So I guess that's kind of a good starting point to start with. But, what is persuasion? What are we talking about when we talk about persuasion first and foremost?
Well, persuasion, that's why the book's called The Soulful Art of Persuasion, because I think persuasion is sort of a dirty word. I think it has a lot of stigma to it. And I think when we think about persuasion, we think about people trying to convince us, or brands convince us to do something, buy something that we don't want to do, or for people, do an action that we may not want to take. And the soulful art is really the idea that building character and trust, or creating a strong brand, helps you to persuade. And so persuasion to me is really, another way to say it is selling. And when we think about brands and we think about CMOs' jobs, their job is really to increase sales for the companies that they work for, or to persuade more people to buy products or services. And we think about people, it could be a million things. We're persuading all day long, right? You're persuading people to listen to your podcast, to get guests on the show, maybe persuading your spouse to, make a move. You're persuading your boss to give you an increase, whatever it might be. We're in this like cosmic dance of persuasion, whether we're a brand or we're a person, all day long. And so it's really important to think about the triggers behind how you can be more successful at that. But I loved what you said about the difference between marketing and branding when we were talking earlier. I think that's something I'd love to come back around to.
And it's interesting how you mentioned the certain triggers, because when I hear the word persuasion, one of the first places my mind goes is the 1957 book, The Hidden Persuaders. I mean, the 1950s were sort of a golden era of modern marketing,
I love
as
that
it
book.
were.
Yeah.
But it was very ad heavy marketing. Back then, the persuaders were little psychological tricks that brands were putting in their ads. I feel like it was more ad driven. And I feel like, especially in this era, where we've moved to kind of mistrusting advertisements a little bit, where we've moved to more of a back and forth with brands, where it's no longer they broadcast information at us and we sort of swallow it up. There's a little bit more of a relationship there. So I'd love your take on sort of how persuasion works now, and
Now,
and
yeah,
how brands kind of tie into that.
I think you're right because that that was in a world of advertising where there's no it's a one way communication, right? And so we're now in a two-way communication, right? And so we also live in this age now where we're in an age of distrust. And when you put something out there, kind of the immediate reaction is that it's bullshit. And people's bullshit detectors are very high. And so today, in order to persuade, you have to be trusted both as a person and as a brand. I keep using those two things, but you have to be trusted and having character. And brands and companies that are trustworthy and have character are more successful. They have more emotional pull. Same way with people. But we live in a much different era now where everyone's always on the lookout to see if they are being persuaded by trickery or if they're being persuaded by authenticity. So I think it's the game's totally changed.
Now, you said when we were talking earlier that people hate being sold to, but they love brands.
Yeah,
So,
people hate
what
advertising,
people hate advertising, but they love brands.
and
So,
that's a
what does
modern.
that mean?
I'm a modern hidden persuader, right? So like that's what I do for a living, and I will admit that people hate advertising. There's a lot of studies that 77% of brands could disappear and no one would care. There's all this research that if you look at people, people don't care if the brands that they buy or are contemplating buying disappeared tomorrow, they wouldn't care. That means there's about 30% or less, 25% of brands that are sticky and that people really love. Those brands communicate differently, they sell differently. And I think it's how do you get into that 23% and not into the 77%. And there was recently, I think it was like last summer, there was a Kantar study that 8 out of 10 people said that ads are annoying. So I don't know what 20% don't think ads are annoying. I mean, I think the right ads aren't annoying, but advertising is typically preventing you from watching the content you really want to watch, or read the story you really want to read, or listen to the podcast that you really want to listen to. And so typically people really don't like advertising, but they like advertising from brands that they've built love for. So if you can build a brand that you love, when you hear a message from that brand, you're much more susceptible to it and you resonate with it. But if it's from a brand you could care less about, you kind of ignore it. So the first order of business in persuading for brands is really to create that love and then turn that into acquisition or results or moving units. And I think today, with performance marketing so at the forefront of advertising spend, a lot of brands skip building the brand love. They don't really think about branding, and they go right into like, I put $1 into a machine and I get $1.20 back. And they measure on what platforms do I get the highest return. But that's short term. That's short term thinking. It's not building long term brand love. And so you're going to have to keep putting that money in that machine to get those returns. And it's going to be a never ending cycle. But if you put investment in branding and creating a brand, and a brand with a purpose, that it stands for something, it has a soul, you know the reason for it to exist, that creates brand love, and you have to spend less money in that conversion part.
Absolutely. To your point, by the way, about who's that 20% who loves ads, I find them
Yeah.
fascinating, which explains why I have a podcast on the Adweek podcast
Yeah,
network.
I mean,
But
you're
that's,
excluded from the study, right?
yeah, well, we're the people who are, in it. So obviously we love it, but that's not the average person at home. And that's part of why advertising really is such an art and a science. But so is branding. I loved what you said about how, you don't have that trust, and your ads are not going to be as effective over the long term if you're not building a brand with it. You mentioned the word soul, which is definitely something I want to get into, because you've got, soul in the name of both your podcast and your book. So let's talk about what you mean when you're talking about soul with connection to persuasion and thus to branding.
Yeah, so on not to talk too much about my podcast on your podcast, but Soul and Science is really, it's our philosophy as a advertising agency, and it's what the podcast is about, where I interview chief marketing officers and really break down this sort of dilemma between soul and science, and how much I believe that the best work is understanding the brand soul, why the brand exists, what it's trying to accomplish, and putting dollars and spend behind that. And then the science can be the data, the results. It can inform the soul. But a brand without a soul is just it's like a person without a soul that is just asking for things. We all have people in our lives like that are purely transactional, and we don't have that established connection or trust with them, because they come to you only when they need something, but they're not building that affinity throughout, so that when they do ask for something, you're obliged to do it. And I think what I think about when I think about soul, it has to come back to the roots of what the brand's trying to accomplish, why it exists in the world. And I think that's really the same as people, and values of the brand and values of your own personal brand have to be really clear and distinct.
So it sounds like soul is ultimately purpose,
I think
and yeah, and purpose is, it goes back to even, Simon Sinek, start with why. That's really what, your purpose can't just be do this thing and make money from it. But at the same time, if you are in business, do this thing and make money from it is, of course, part of what you're trying to accomplish. So how can brands just make sure
yeah.
that, the business part doesn't take over and they've got something that people can connect with on a deeper level? How do you sort of keep in touch with that and make sure that you don't just become kind of business behemoth that doesn't have that soul?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really great question. And um, I think the word purpose, going back to, the word you keyed in on there with purpose, I think today, um, just like, I talk about in the book, um, I call the book that I talk about 11 habits to become a master influencer. It's really, influencer is any person that's trying to persuade. It's not what we think of as, either a TikTok influencer or a YouTube influencer. So I'm using that differently. And when it comes to purpose, purpose is the brand purpose is what you're trying to achieve, why what you're trying to accomplish. It isn't necessarily a higher order purpose like a social good purpose. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to ladder all the way up to, this brand's trying to become, a nonprofit or change the world. It's really, what is the purpose for the product or service? Why does it exist? How is it differentiated? Why does it deserve to be in the world? And ultimately, why should people care about it? And so that's the way I use purpose. But your question was, how do we get brands to care about that?
I mean, how do we make sure that brands, because of course a brand is always part of their purpose, is always going to be what they're
Selling.
selling.
Yeah.
ultimately, and selling it successfully. So, how can brands make sure that they keep that sense of being tied to their purpose? And of course, that they're able to communicate it so that it's very clear to the people following the brand that they're not just following a brand who wants their money, but they're following a brand that has a deeper, more soulful purpose to it.
Yes, good question. I think you have to really uh, it's really about emotional versus rational, and I think it's trying to communicate and hitting people's emotions to get them to respond to the brand. And it's not rational where it's using, you talked about the hidden persuaders, where that advertising might be about, cost, or, you know, why this product will last longer. It's really rational. It's rational communication to get people to want to, part with their wallet. And I think branding, or soul or purpose, is the emotional reason. It's the storytelling behind why the brand exists, what it's trying to accomplish. When you think of a brand like Disney, and you think of the one word that you think of is magic, that's a purpose brand that's connecting with the consumer. You're not thinking about, the until you get there, of course, the park costs, or how much it's gonna, or how long the waits are. You're thinking about this higher order of connection to that, getting a piece of that magic from Disney. Or obviously, on the other extreme, a brand people always talk about is Patagonia, because they are real into, saving the planet, and that is their reason for being. And they happen to sell products for people exploring the outdoors, but they have a higher purpose, a higher emotional connection. They'll never sell based on, like data points. They're going to sell on this higher purpose that you're buying into. So that's how brands have to think about it. And I think more nascent brands, or more tech focused brands, they oftentimes will skip that higher brand thing, and they'll go right into the rational and the bells and whistles and the reasons to believe that are facts and figures. And that burns out pretty quickly, because you don't have an emotional connection to the brand. You have a rational connection only to the brand, and it's only serving a limited purpose when you need that product or service, but you don't have any feelings for the brand.
You do need that balance though, because,
Yes.
you can have a brand that has all the purpose in the world. You're certainly trying to do good. Hopefully the products are decent. You've got the soul part, on lock. But then you don't really have a strong brand. I've certainly seen plenty of those, especially when I worked with small businesses and I worked directly with like this person who was doing like a one person thing. They had all the soul in place. Like they knew what they were doing, they believed in it, they had a story, but they didn't really properly have a brand. And thus, they were not able to use that brand to make connections with people and to persuade. So they had the passion, they had the soul. There was something missing in that translation from soul to brand that got lost and didn't let the business succeed. And of course, we've seen the opposite too. We've seen plenty of soulless corporations that succeed plenty well. So the brand piece is what I'd really love to kind of define. Like what do you need to do? What's the alchemy there that takes you from having a soul and having a purpose to then translating that into a brand that people can really connect with?
Yeah. So, I mean, one brand that I always love to talk about that really came out of nowhere was, Liquid Death. They're, they sell the most benign, easy product in the world, which is water, right? They package water up, but they package water up around a brand story, which is Liquid Death, which is a dangerous name. It's about murdering your thirst. It's about selling it in cans, which is much healthier for the planet. And so they created this whole story selling the most, you know, um, unoriginal product in the world of water. But they did it around building, you know, a logo, symbols, a name, a line of what they stand for. That they put out, and now they're selling water, but they really are selling the brand. They're selling Liquid Death through apparel and skateboards and watches and anything you can think of to get a piece of that brand lifestyle. And so they really created this brand from selling the easiest thing in the world, which is water. And so I think that's a good example. And I don't know, in your example, if the story was there, but it was tied too much to an individual or a person and their story, because you have to often separate the founder story, which is one track, to the brand story. And if it's
Yeah.
too connected, you're almost only just selling the personal brand story, which is hard to translate into selling products.
Yeah, it's
So
like,
those are
what's
two
in it
different
for
things.
me?
Yeah, yeah. What is the thing that you're selling me that will, make my life better? Something I'm proud to put on. What's the icon for it? What does it represent in the world? And I think that piece has to be separated from the founder or originator, their story, and they have to be two different things.
I like what you said about how part of the Liquid Death thing is you're sort of selling the lifestyle, because you're right. It is such a basic product. It's water. It literally falls from the sky. We're made up mostly of it. But also, there's a lot of people trying to sell us water. So, why would someone buy Liquid Death over something else? And part of that persuasion, as you implied, is the lifestyle element. Like, it seems cool. So, I mean, how.
And it's original. That's the other
Yeah.
really important thing for branding, is it's original in a sea of water products that are, mostly different names with different plastic bottle configurations. You go in there to the store and you see something that really is original and pops out and stands out. That's really important for branding. You have to be an original, and you have to be saying something different. And when it goes to, that's a brand that's really based on very little performance and very high branding advertising, because they do a lot of viral videos, they leverage a lot of influencers. They don't do a lot of click to buy types of advertising. They're really all about brand and brand. And if they had tested that brand, Liquid Death, with consumer panel, and done all their research and focused only on the data, no one would have said that's a good name. No one would have said, "Yeah, I'll buy a product that has death in it um, to drink more water and be healthy." No one would immediately think that that makes logical sense, because it's so different. It stands out, and because it stands out, they can pour money into branding and not worry as much about just performance driven marketing.
So it's about this balance, it sounds like, of style and substance. So you have to have the substance, you have to have the soul of your brand first. Then the style is part of what makes it persuasive, is what I'm hearing. How do you make sure.
I always think about that. Sorry to cut you off
No, go
there.
for it.
I always think about that as like a Tootsie Pop. It's like the style. I like how you framed it with substance and style, but what's inside the Tootsie Pop, you're wrapping. It's like the medicine is the soul and what it's trying to do, and the style is the wrapping around it. It's the color and the look, and how you dress it up, and the origin, or the reason for the brand, is right in the middle. But you need to have both. You need to have the substance and then the style wrapped around it.
Yeah, how do you make sure that they're in balance? Like, if
That was a
something about.
terrible analogy, by the way, with
No,
the Tootsie Pop.
it's all good, and now I got the
I
little
wish I had
owl.
another one. It just popped in my head.
Ooh.
Go ahead.
No, I want to hear the other one.
No, I don't have another one. I
Oh,
wish I
okay.
did. I need to come up with another one for our second podcast.
Oh, there you go. Well, I feel like, how do you make sure that they're in balance? Like, let's say your brand is just failing to catch. It's just failing to persuade. And you feel like, well, I've got the purpose and we've got this, good-looking brand package out there. Something's just not connecting. So how do you sort of troubleshoot that and figure out if the issue where that issue is in that failure of communication. Is it a failure to communicate the purpose? Is it a matter of just the vehicle is falling short? How do you identify where that imbalance is that is getting in the way of your ability to persuade as a brand?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think oftentimes it is about doing some risky work that you might not succeed. But I think a lot of times, especially with smaller brands that don't have big budgets, their work is can become wallpaper and it can't stand out, even if they have the right look and the right product and the right substance and style. When they go to market the substance and style and put it out there, they're doing it in a conventional way or a way that's too safe that doesn't get noticed. And therefore, it won't connect, it won't rise above the noise, and it'll get lost. And I think you have to be able to have some beautiful failures and try and experiment and do new things in order to stand out. And I think too often brands won't take too many risks or experiment. Maybe experiment on new platforms, maybe experiment with some, scary marketing tactics that aren't necessarily safe. Because anytime you're following a playbook that is tried and true, the chances of it standing out are very low. And you're going to have to spend much more money to stand out and to get noticed. And if you have the money, you can do it. And if you don't have the money, you're going to have to take a riskier path.
I like that. Yeah. So if the math's not mathing, stop trying to make it math.
If the math isn't mathing, do something besides math.
Nice, nice. Bring some soul to your science. I like
It's just
that.
yeah.
All right. So this has been great. I have loved this exploration. I think we both had some like good little mic drop moments in there, if I do
I
say
agree.
so
I agree.
ourselves.
I'm gonna start using the substance and style. I like that.
Oh, go for it. All right. So Jason Harris, tell everyone where they can find you, why they should find you, and what they will find there.
Well, it really depends what you're looking for. You can find more about the agency at Mekanism.com. It's with Mekanism and see the brands that we work with. You can find out more about the book at thesoulfulart.com. And I think why you might want to think about the book is I think it's very good for people that are looking at developing their personal brand, because it really is about how do you persuade through your character and how do you persuade by being an original and standing out. And it's the same exercise that we have to do with brands. I think we also have people can do that with their personal brand as well. So I think that's the why.
Awesome. And you know what? I'm going to throw a final question in there just because it's occurring to me. So I had you kind of define persuasion and define soulful and all that. How would you define a brand?
How would I define a brand? Like a brand, a personal brand, or any brand?
Anything. What's
Just
a
in
brand?
general. I think a brand is what. Let's talk about brand. Okay, I like that. I think a brand is really what the product or service is that you're selling, but it's higher order. It's the emotional and rational that have come together to form a brand. It's the reason why it exists. It's why it's different. What makes it original, and then coupled with what the product or service is, and you put the emotional and rational together to form a brand.
Awesome. Well, thank you
How would you
so much.
define how would you define brand?
Oh, I mean, I mostly talk about personal branding. So I say the brand is the version of you that lives in other people's heads. But that applies for consumer brands as well. I mean, hopefully you're taking up that real estate in some way and some impression has made its way through to live in people's heads. And you just want to be in control of what that impression is and keeping it in there in a positive way.
Love that. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's great.
I try. I talk about brand a lot.
I can tell you do.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Jason. This has been great.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you, whether you are listening to Let's Talk About Brand on the Adweek Podcast Network or you're watching us here on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Let's Talk About Brand on your podcast player of choice so you don't miss a single Monday episode, and that you subscribe to Christine Gritmon Inc. on YouTube so that you check out these video episodes on Fridays. And in between, every Tuesday, I'm over on Twitter hosting Chat About Brand, where you can weigh in on the week's topics. Thanks so much. Bye.